And if people don't mind reposting the space, let's let everyone know, because we do know that Colonel Towner, Bridget, and everyone gets censored and not shown as much. So let's post it out and let's break the algorithms, because there's so much happening. Holy cow.
Yeah. And today will be because it's Wednesday, so it's going to be a short day. I will be on Alpha Warrior this evening and at 9:30 Eastern time. And we are going to talk about a very interesting follow-on to USAID. Y'all aren't going to want to miss it, because we're going to talk about a whole bunch of corrupt companies inside the United States. So it'll be a very interesting segment. Okay, we're going to go ahead. I know we're a couple of minutes early, but I want to go ahead and get started only because we're going to have to finish earlier today. So
over on Rumble, you are still showing the intro.
Okay, well, I don't understand why, because I'm looking at myself and it says that I'm live.
Okay. I got nothing. I can't help. I wish I could. But,
well, maybe.
Okay, there you are. There you are.
Yeah.
There you are. Sorry.
That's okay.
Double checking. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. Now, keep in mind where we're at. We are talking about the circle and some of the hangers-on of Operation Gladio, their enabler parts, their appendages, whatever you want to call it. So that's where we're at. And basically, we're at the part in talking about, ironically enough, terrorism. And probably a good way to start this thing off is I want everybody, because we're doing all of this history so that we can better understand what's going on in the country today. Now, we know, and I want you guys as active as you've ever been. We know that the National Security Council in the past has executive orders, action memorandums, all of that stuff that says, here's what you're authorized to do based on these designations. And you guys remember that originally the designation to assassinate people was basically only communist. But right around the time the wall fell, we had to add terrorist. And then everybody became a terrorist because communist was no longer the proper, or we didn't have enough of them. They weren't the appropriate boogeyman. We're going to transition into another boogeyman. And that became terrorist. And so all the subsequent presidents had to do was claim that someone was a terrorist. The only problem with that was the CIA, just like back in the day when they created the Bolshevik Revolution and quote unquote communism, now everybody looks, the whole hammer nail thing, everybody looks like a terrorist now if they want to kill you. And the problem underlying all of it is, who are we getting the intelligence from on who's who, right? That matters. So the intelligence in the past had been based on the CIA, and the CIA, every time they wanted to kill someone for the international syndicate, they magically became a communist until they magically became a terrorist. And that was a justification. And just like in the case with Assad, we're going to try to assassinate him. The same thing with Omar Gaddafi. They all became terrorists. They staged plane crashes to then claim somebody was a terrorist. Just like they staged plane crashes to claim that Castro was a communist so that they could go after him. This is a very dangerous slope. And I don't want anyone to not be able to speak up coherently about the risk associated with where they get their intelligence from. So it just obviously said that Marco Rubio designated all of these different groups as terrorists. Well, that's fine. Okay, they're terrorists. Who created the terrorist? Who trained the terrorist? Who equipped the terrorist? Who funded them? And I'm going back to the CIA. All of the terrorist networks were created initially by the CIA to include all the drug networks. So we're basically using CIA intelligence to determine who the good guys and bad guys are, which is the same people that created the bad guys. And how do we know that we're not back in 1972 when we're doing the quote unquote war on drugs and all we're doing is eliminating the competition? That's the risk you run, number one, when you can't trust your government and when you rely on the CIA for anything, because they're a corrupt bunch of criminals. So just be apprised that we still need to be very cautious about what's going on and vocal about what the slippery slope is, because there is definitely a slippery slope. Okay. So, back to our book. All right. So we talked about the two basically the circle people, and that VDB, which was, let me go back and find his name because they started using his initials. And since we're starting a new segment, I wanted to go back and get his actual name. So hold on just a second. While I find that. Something D, crazy last name. Hold on. Dadgummit. All right. Of course, I won't be able to find it right away. Basically, you have members of the circle, and they have been intimately involved in vice rings involving children. And they were linked to that. One of the Bonvoisin, Bonvoisin, was linked to them by Latimus, who was basically one of them. He was recruited into it. So Latimus said that the children provided a quote unquote insurance policy. Where have I heard that term before? That's weird. And that they used that to keep people quiet. The wife of a guy by the name of Dr. Pinon, Pinon, ran a child vice ring as well with people from the circle. And it involved members of the Belgium political parties. Latimus' knowledge of these dealings did not seem to do him much good, since he quote unquote committed suicide in 1984. We would refer to it, based on the circumstances of the suicide, as being suicided. So these people in the circle would later feature prominently in the Marc Dutroux scandal. Marc Dutroux, of course, we know, was the Belgian pedophile and serial killer that was finally arrested in 1996. He was accused of having kidnapped, tortured, and sexually abused children between the age of 8 and 19, 4 of whom they confirmed died because they found their dead bodies in his house. A close associate of Dutroux had been Michael Nihal, Nihoul. He was a businessman with a long history of criminal activity. The Dutroux investigation began to unfold, and allegations emerged that Dutroux had kidnapped several girls for Nihal, who had in turn set up a pedophile ring catering to people coming into Brussels and NATO headquarters. This spurred several witnesses who had been involved in the network to come forward. They named the people in Le Cercle, and these allegations are especially disturbing in light of the accusations that was going on at the Dignity Colony in Chile, where many of their victims at the colony had been picked up and kidnapped in Germany and shipped to Chile. There is at least one direct link between the academy and the colony. Franz Joseph Strauss, who provided the academy with all of its initial money. Beyond that, von Voisin would become a Cercle regular, and in 1980s, he began to encounter Strauss and became one of his agents. An indirect connection comes from the form of the above-mentioned Count Hans Graf Huyn, and I'm going to spell his last name. His first name is Hans, and then Graf, Graf, and Huyn, Huin. You will recall that he was a member of the IFD, which was a Cercle auxiliary, along with Dr. Lothar Bossel, Bossle, and another guy by the name of Dieter Blumenwitz, who became crucial colony backers in the 1980s. Huyn had been very active in the academy since 1972. Then there was also an Opus Dei connection. During the years of 1985 and 86, Jacques Thoma, Thoma, who was involved with the youth wing of the Party Social Cretin, PSC, alleges that he attended several mass orgies. The details of Thoma provided from at least one of these orgies was incredible. And this is what he had to say. They involved Satanism, drinking blood, also children in the 13 or 14-year-old range, one of whom reportedly died on an altar as a sacrifice. When Thoma asked what the purpose of this spectacle was, he was told that it was an Opus Dei initiation ritual. The guy that wrote this book said he felt compelled to emphasize that these are allegations, and what's more, cases of sexual abuse committed by these figures directly linked to Opus Dei are relatively rare, but not non-existent. The allegations are interesting in light of the epidemic of child abuse committed at the colony Dignity. The strong presence of Opus Dei in Chile and the reputed Opus Dei member Franz Joseph Strauss patronage funding of the colony. But certainly there is a certain degree of speculation involved in all of it, because obviously no one has been convicted of the connection between Opus Dei and all of this. It's just saying that there is an overlap of all of these people and the academy, the colony, as far as people and the people funding and creating these things. They're basically, the author is trying to paint patterns of behavior where you can speculate as to what they all mean. Regardless, there can be little question that the circle complex had extensive links to the Gladio networks. On one hand, both the circle complex and Gladio were linked with Catholic orders like Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta. The hierarchy of both the circle and various Gladio networks appear to be common with many Opus Dei participants and the Knights of Malta. On the other hand, the circle also maintained extensive contacts with Gladio networks through numerous groups, one of which, of course, was the propaganda duo and all of its branch that we now have learned about. The Academy was also another one that coordinated activity between the two. It linked Agenter Press, the propaganda lodge offices, and various Belgium people to the strategy of tension. And Agenter Press and P2 in particular are linked to terrorism, not just in Europe and not just in Italy, but all over the world. As such, it should be little surprise that there are links between Gladio and Condor. And equally unsurprising, the circle complex ties to Condor as well. A crucial figure who links the sprawling network together was the legendary Italian fascist Stefano Delle Che. And I'm going to spell his last name. It's two names, Dellechie. Delle Che appears to have been he came to the attention of the circle complex as early as 1959. Italian industrialist, read that as oligarch, Carlos Pesenti, P-E-S-E-N-T-I, would begin funding Delle Che and his fascist militia that was referred to as Avanguardia Nazionale, AN. Pesenti provided the AN network with a monthly stipends to do their work. Pesenti would go on to become a key patron of both the Academy and the Circle. He became an especially influential member of the Circle, and in his autobiography, David Rockefeller mentions the Circle as the Pesenti Group. That's how much money he spent on the Circle activities. In 1965, Delle Che would play a key role in formulating the strategy of tension. We already know it was established well before that. He's just crafting parts of it. He became a founding member of Agenter Press with the Sirac in 1966. In 1969, the strategy of tension was hitting its stride in Italy when the Piazza Fontana was bombed. Both Delle Che and his AN gang, along with the Agenter Press, were implicated in the bombing. Delle Che also was linked to one of the final and most devastating incidences in the strategy of tension in Italy. It obviously wasn't the final one, and that was the Bologna massacre that left 85 dead. Delle Che was also a P2 member. In 1970, Delle Che and the AN organization would participate in Operation Tora Tora, T-O-R-A, Tora Tora, which was an attempted coup of Italy that had the CIA backing. The leader of this coup was the Black Prince, Prince Borghese. During World War II, Borghese had led the murderous partisan campaign in Mussolini's Republic that resulted in the death of hundreds of Italians that they had deemed communistic in nature, and basically they were just rebelling against Mussolini, not necessarily communist. At the end of the war, Borghese was set to be hanged by the Italians that were in control of the government at the time, but CIA, then OSS, James Jesus Angleton saved his life because they intended to use him as part of Operation Gladio. This may help explain why the Borghese coup, as Operation Tora Tora, was called off at the last minute because some of the members had seized the Interior Ministry from orders, quote unquote, from above, which was basically the CIA. Undeterred, the Black Prince and Delashay made for Madrid in the aftermath of the aborted coup. And it was the CIA that called it off, by the way, because they felt like it had been compromised. And of course, Spain is where Otto Skorzeny and Fascist Internationalist has its home. So no big surprise there. And of course, Otto Skorzeny took in Delashay and the Black Prince and provided them with a place to stay. Their close relationship with Otto Skorzeny basically revealed that he viewed Delashay as a protege and someone that he could pass off some of his specialty skilled training to. It would also seem that Delashay worked closely with the Paladin group, Paladin, during this time. The Paladin outfit had been founded by Gerhard Hartmut von Schubert sometime around 1968. Von Schubert was a veteran of Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Prior to the founding of Paladin Group, he had helped train Peron's secret police and disseminate propaganda on behalf of Nasser in Egypt. Skorzeny also had dealings in Egypt, having been hired to train and assist their security forces in the 1950s. Paladin had also been described as an international directorship of strategic assault personnel straddle the watershed between paramilitary carried out by troops in uniforms and the political warfare, which was conducted by civilian agents. In essence, it was a private intelligence group and mercenary firm, what would now be known as a private military company. In a sense, Paladin blazed the trail and became the first one. It was also thought that companies like DynCorp and Blackwater followed in its footsteps. By all accounts, it was the head and shoulders above the rest. One former OAS, which remember is France's paramilitary Gladio operators, involved in Paladin, described it as undoubtedly the most serious of all private intelligence and action services that was around. Paladin's clients included the service intelligence of Spain and Greece and South Vietnamese government. Now, I want to point out something. Spain is a dictatorship that's in bed with the CIA. Greece was we had couped that government. And that was the coup of the 5 colonels, one of which was Papadopoulos, if you remember. So it's under the control of the CIA. And of course, South Vietnam at this time is under the control of either France or the CIA and or both. So basically, what this author is saying is Paladin was a company that the CIA hired to basically monitor or occupy countries that had already been overthrown by the CIA to make sure they didn't get out of line. Their corporate clients included Cadbury chocolates and Rhine metal. In many English languages sources, Skorzeny is typically described as the actual founder of the Paladin Group. However, This author did not find any evidence of that. But if you go to Major Gannis's book in the Scorzini papers, he basically gives you the trail. It is beyond question that Scorzini had some involvement in Paladin. Initially, the Paladin organization largely drew from the ranks of other Nazis and French OAS, which were the fascist element in France that was kind of the ones that cooperated with Hitler during the war. They are also the ones that wanted to keep all of the French colonies as slaves. It is likely that many of the OAS men were involved in Sirac's Agenter Press network in Portugal, which is true. Also, Scorzini had helped Sirac establish Agenter's Press paramilitary organization around the same time, which is also true, because Scorzini trained not only Agenter Press people, but also the OAS. Because if you guys recall, they had set up paramilitary training bases all along the border of Spain and France. Paladin's British affiliate was Watchguard International, another early military intelligence corporation. Watchguard had been founded by SAS co-founder David Sterling, who was a colonel. Sterling was a close associate of the Circle and all of its British partners. As such, Paladin already had an interesting cast of characters at its disposal when Dalachet arrived. Now that Paladin group's ranks were growing, it included many Italian fascists. This unleashed a wave of terror in Spain in the early to mid 1970s, which resulted in over 1,000 attacks that left 50 dead and hundreds wounded. As such, Paladin appears to have played a similar role in Spain as it did in Portugal, increasing the strategy of tension. Dalachet also appears to have forged ties with Baron Benoit de von Boysen around this same time. In 1975, Dalachet attended a gathering of European fascists at Van Boysen's castle. Also present were members of fellow Italian fascist outfits like Ordine Nuovo, which is the New Order, and MSI, as well as UK's National Front and Spain's fascist elements. Naturally, Belgium was represented by Front de la Journée. However, by the mid-1970s, Dalachet was increasingly drawn to Latin America. Naturally, Pinochet's Chile would call out to Dalachet, and in 1974, he and Prince Borghese, the Black Prince from Italy, paid them a visit. He was received by Pinochet himself. Dalachet would go to work for DINA, which was the secret police that tortured and assassinated and kidnapped everybody in Chile. By the middle of the decade, Dalachet had reportedly been provided with his own office in Santiago by DINA. Dalachet would go on to work closely with none other than Michael Vernon Townley, who was the CIA guy working on Operation Condor in the area. The most noteworthy was the attempted assassination of Bernardo Leighton, a former Chilean interior minister in Rome, Dalachet's backyard, during 1975. Dalachet's South American activities were not just limited to Chile. He would operate throughout the continent. By the late 1970s, he had also established a presence in Bolivia, and he worked closely with the Fiancé of Death, which was a private army supported by the military dictatorship that had been installed in Bolivia by the CIA. The Fiancé of Death were comprised of the inevitable collection of former Nazis and OAS men. They also had additional fascists from all over Europe. The group was headed by an individual that, that we all know, former Gestapo and SS man Klaus Barbie. It will be recalled that Barbie was a key South American business partner in the arms company ran by Otto Skorzeny called Murex, and his business partner, Gerhard Martens. Barbie also was a key business associate of P2 Grandmaster Gelly in South America. It's interesting to note that Barbie and Delachaux had also participated in many of the same Gladio operations in Europe and in many of the same ones in South America under Condor. Barbie had been recruited by the Army Counterintelligence Corps in 1947 to assist in setting up additional German stay-behind networks. And this network crystallized into a thing called the BDJ, which was then exposed in the 1950s. It necessitated Barbie's flight to South America when it got discovered. Barbie would later represent the Bolivian intelligence agency in at least one meeting dealing with Operation Condor. Delachaux would also follow in Barbie's footsteps into the Bolivian cocaine industry, because again, all of this is tied to each other. It's one network. So, the author says that if you look at, he basically is calling this thing a black orchestra. We call it the International Syndicate. And he described it as a confederate of organizations linked to terrorism, assassination, arms, and drug trafficking. And of course, he's describing the Operation Gladio aspect of it. And he mentions all of the different components, and that Otto Skorzeny seemed to have been at the head of it for the training, both not only in Europe, but also of the people that were forward deployed into Latin America. Some of these units were incorporated into Operation Bloodstone, which became a Gladio-type project targeting the Soviet satellites. Skorzeny went to work in the old Sofindus network, then under the control of the World Commerce Corporation, a private intelligence company of SOE, the Brits, and OSS veterans. And by the late 1960s, Skorzeny had become a key factor in this Operation Gladio/Condor network. His Paladin group, along with the Genter Press and Delachaux's Avanguardia Nacionale, were among the pillars of the network. Many of these groups would participate in acts of terrorism linked to Gladio. At the same time, the Circle brought aboard some interesting partners. In the early years, the Circle was largely dominated by reactionary Catholic orders like the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei. Beginning in the mid to late 1960s, they began to forge crucial alliances along with the Brits and the Americans' intelligence agencies. On the British side, Brian Cozier brought his SOE veterans to the Circle complex. Among the American partners were several former OSS men and current CIA people like William Casey. Casey, it will be recalled, worked for William Donovan's law firm back in Buffalo, and the same law firm that did legal work for the World Commerce Corporation. Both Donovan and Casey would also be Knights of Malta. They also had connections to the Circle. By the early 70s, the Circle complex appeared to have forged close ties with the Black Orchestra, or Operation Gladio, which Otto Skorzeny was a key figure of. The same Otto Skorzeny had forged all of the alliances with the World Commerce Corporation at the beginning of the 1950s and joined the Circle and Gladio. In any case, the alliance created what this author calls a special operations mafia. I don't know why you make up names. It's called Operation Gladio, but whatever. This nexus brought together veterans of the British, American, and Nazi special forces to engage in covert operations in a private capacity. In some cases, there was no doubt working on behalf of the Brits and American intelligence services, but he also thinks that they had their own agenda. What he doesn't realize is, again, and this is a common fallacy. People look at this, and I did too originally, so it's not like a knock or anything. You are under the impression that the British intelligence service actually works for the British. And you're under the impression that the CIA actually works for the United States government. They don't. And the reason why it looks like they have their own agenda is because they don't have their actual own agenda. They all work for the international syndicate. And they take their orders from this international syndicate because the international syndicate wants access to the resources in the countries they're going to go overthrow. And the more you research you do on this topic, the more evident that becomes. So what about the colony? Clearly, it was a part of this network. On one hand, the colony was in contact with the Circle via Strauss. The Circle auxiliaries in Europe were mobilized to protect the colony and did so against Amnesty International attempts to document what was going on there. On the other hand, the colony enjoyed contact with many parts of this, to include the paramilitary, because they were a storage of weapons, they were manufacturing weapons there, and they were a terrorist training camp. Much like Jim Jones in Jonestown. A key colony backer was Gerhard Martens, who was Scorzini's partner. Then there's Stefano Dallasce himself, who was also a guest at the colony. While the colony's connection to Condor is very well known, its ties to Dallasce raise the possibility that it was also linked to Gladio. It also indicates the connection between Otto Skorzeny and Martens and the colony further documents that it was an extension of Operation Gladio. And it was Martens who was approached to supply arms to General Spinola to participate in the Portuguese strategy of tension with the Genter press. Spinola's efforts also appear to have received the support from the same organization, the Circle. The colony seemingly enjoyed impeccable contacts throughout the entire network of both Condor and Gladio, both from street-level terrorists who were trained there and armed there, but also from people like Dallasce, who was fairly high up in the network. And of course, they received funding from Strauss, who basically ran one aspect of it. While many of these contacts emerged after the Pinochet coup, it is important to remember that when the Chilean DINA first made contact with the German BND, which is Reinhard Gehlen, Otto Skorzeny's boss, the Germany's, it was the colony that made the introduction. So again, you have the special secret police, DINA, who were trained by the CIA, and they're meeting the BND, and you have the colony in the middle of those introductions. The colony clearly had intelligence ties. This also validates claims that the colony was a crucial node, not just in Operation Condor, but in Operation Gladio as well, acting as a coordinating center in Latin America for international operations and a critical portion of the strategy of tension. The shock, in 2007, journalist Naomi Klein published her now classic The Shock Doctrine, and I've quoted her before in threads. The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. As the title implies, this work was chief among concerns with the effects of a sudden privatization of the nation's economy and the aftershocks that it creates. Now, let me back up just a second. So we know that this is all about resources. So I'm going to use two different examples. In the case of Chile, that had been a democracy for 100 years, there were basically no government-owned entities. They were all private because they were a democracy. And that is usually when the CIA installs a dictator, they will collectively nationalize temporarily anything that's in the hands of patriots. So it looks like they're going to be a communist, even though they overthrew it because they wanted to get rid of a designated communist. It's crazy. But then what happens is it's a reappropriation of whatever those assets are. So let's just take for an example and pretend that ITT didn't own the phone company. And let's just say that was another owner that was a patriot that didn't like the fact that Allende had been murdered and Pinochet had been installed. What Pinochet would do is appropriate that company and say, we're going to nationalize it. But then as soon as that guy basically got disappeared, he would resell it to an oligarch that the CIA had approved of. In the case of Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, where everything had been owned by the government, there is a period of privatization. And when that happened, the venture capitalist in the United States, like Broward, and Safra, the guy that funded his Hermitage Capital Fund, would go in and basically, like scum-sucking sharks, scoop up all the privatization. And that was one of the reasons why they would overthrow countries, is so that they could monopolize the resources and the businesses after the fact. So I just want everyone to understand that there are different faces to how this whole thing, but the whole bottom line, the goal of everything, is to get as much of the money producing things, like squeezing blood out of a turnip. They want anything that in that country that could possibly make a profit, they want in the hands of the international syndicate, however they do it. And there are different ways of doing it. So Naomi Klein talks about this in what she calls the shock doctrine, the rise of disaster capitalism. So you create a disaster, i.e. Operation Gladio coups, in order to effect capitalism, or what is billed as capitalism, when in fact it's actually fascism, because you are going to install a dictator to ensure the oligarchs have the resources and a monopoly on those resources, so there's no competition and therefore no capitalism. So it normally happens, the point she makes, is when there is a sudden privatization of a nation's economy, and there are aftershocks, which is why she refers to it as the shock doctrine. The shock doctrine, which frequently is employed in a different scenario of traumas to fundamentally alter a nation, like a coup. While Klein tends to focus on the shocks brought about by the Chicago School of Economics, she compellingly argues that other aspects of this trauma were based on techniques developed by the MK Ultra program and other CIA Pentagon behavior modification experiments. Klein, in particular, singled out Chile, describing the Pinochet-led coup and the years that followed as a laboratory in which the shock doctrine was first deployed. She noted 3 stages that have been repeated over and over again by US-backed regime changes ever since. First, there's an initial shock of a coup or some man-made disaster. Then, followed by the shock of the Chicago school-styled privatization and the shock of rampant torture to disenfranchise anyone from standing up. In Chile, these techniques were employed with pinpoint precision. In particular, Pinochet and his supporters appeared to have keenly been aware that propaganda was necessary as well as torture. One of the most shocking aspects of Pinochet's coup and subsequent military dictatorship was just how bloodless it was. Like, they didn't do like Taiwan and they were like spearing people in the streets with bayonets. In total, about 3,200 individuals were killed and disappeared, but generally they were disappeared and killed out of sight. Like the guy, Dan Medioroni, that went down there and was torturing people in the basement, and then they disposed of the bodies. It was largely done outside of sight, but it was still traumatic shock, the fact that it was happening and people were talking about it. So after 17 years of a military dictatorship, if you take Pinochet and contrast it with Argentina, in their military dictatorship, they were markedly different, almost like they're experimenting on which one's going to give them the best bang for the buck. So in Argentina, about 9,000 people, up to 30,000 people were murdered, depending on whose numbers you use. Of course, the official government numbers was as low as 9,000, but most human rights organizations says it was more like around 30,000. Because, of course, remember, Argentina is the country where they were taking up so many dead bodies. They were taking them up in aircraft and dumping them out in the ocean, so they didn't have to worry about burying them. The Intelligence Battalion 601, which took the lead in Argentina's military, was commonly referred to this entire thing as a dirty war. They themselves estimated that there was 22,000 people murdered between the years of 75 and 78 alone. That's just 3 years. And that military coup, I think, lasted over 10 years. After nearly 2 decades of power, Pinochet had killed fewer of his own citizens than the Argentine military had in a single year. In 1976 alone, it was estimated that Argentina military had killed over 10,000 in just that 1 year. And yet Pinochet still struck fear in the hearts of everybody's mind. A lot of this had to do with perception. The Argentine generals went to great lengths to depict themselves as moderates. Their coup was framed as a legitimate overthrow of a corrupt government. They received support from practically all major political parties and approval from major media outlets because they owned them. And by they, I mean the CIA. Even the demeanor of the generals was in stark contrast to Pinochet. No one donned a cape or dark glasses during the coup. And yet the brutality far exceeded anything seen under Pinochet. Despite this, Argentina's military rule did not so thoroughly traumatize the public to the extent that Pinochet did in Chile. Indeed, the great lengths appear to have been taken to keep the killings and general terror out of the public's eye. Pinochet embraced a propaganda of the deed. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, the political opponents were rounded up and interned in Chile's national stadium, where they were publicly subjected to MK Ultra-like techniques. Pinochet then dispatched one of his most trusted generals on a tour of various prisons in the northern provinces. The subversives selected from these prisons were summarily executed as a public spectacle, and it was referred to as the Caravan of Death. In the weeks following the coup, it became common for dead bodies to start showing up, not just in highways, but also in canals, just floating down the water. The colony itself acquired a kind of a mystical status as a final resting place for anyone that opposed Pinochet. Thus, while the Argentina military dictatorship comes off as violent, Pinochet's was downright surgical. Pinochet recognized that limited violence used highly public fashion was devastating to a nation, and thus murdering tens of thousands of people was not necessarily necessary. The same could be said for Operation Condor. Despite a fearsome reputation, it was responsible for a relatively small number of deaths among the collective military dictatorships because it basically encompassed the entire area of South America and up into Central America. The real value of Condor came down to the assassinations and disappearance of anyone that they designated as a dissident. There was a clear message sent: don't mess with the regime. Again, the propaganda of the dead was a great value. Klein would continuously link these techniques back to the CIA, and she basically said that the author doesn't think that she was aware that Pinochet's methods were basically linked to the European Operation Gladio and the strategy of tension. Because when you read her writings, it is apparent that she did not make that connection. So, the framework for the strategy of tension has been gradually laid at the end of World War II, and its birth is generally credited with a conference that was held in Rome. The conference was sponsored by an organization called Alberto Palio Institute of Military Studies. It was a think tank with the purpose of developing a strategy and tactics for combating quote unquote communism. It had been set up in 1964 by Colonel Renzo Rocca, Rocca, and on behalf of the Italian intelligence service SIFAR, SIFAR. Rocca was the head of SIFAR's Office of Economic and Industrial Research. While nominally concerned about industrial counter-espionage, Rocca's unit also oversaw a large part of the Gladio network that had been set up in Italy. Because, again, that just makes sense if you understand this. Gladio was set up to protect the industrial companies. Rocca received assistance for the latter endeavor from William King Harvey. And you guys will remember William Harvey because he's a CIA guy. At the time, Harvey was the CIA station chief in Italy. It also is interesting to note that Rocca's ultimate boss at the time was none other than Julio Andreotti, the, at the time, Italian defense minister, who goes on to become the prime minister and is forced into admitting in 1990 that Gladio exists, and they've been behind it the entire time. So it is very interesting that as the defense minister, he was basically tied to setting up the entire thing. Andreotti enjoyed very close ties to the CIA, and the secret services inside of Italy, first as defense minister and then later as prime minister. Andreotti was deeply involved in the Gladio planning over the years, and he also was a co-founder of the Circle. He was also inducted into the Knights of Malta and a high up person in the P2 Lodge. So, one of their conferences featured a topic called Revolutionary Warfare, the Instrument of World Expansion. The conference endorsed the view that the Third World War had already begun and that it was being fought at a low level of military intensity, which, guys, this is exactly what the Fabian Society said, that after World War II, you would begin the Third World War, and it would go on until you have one world government via the strategy of tension. There you have it. Communists were accused of the general disintegration of society through quote unquote subversion, while in fact these assholes are the one doing it. So, unsurprisingly, there was a universal call to put in a revolutionary war in order to combat an enemy that didn't exist. But of course, they call it a counter-revolutionary, as if the communist was actually a threat. All right. And part of the agenda was the creation of clandestine, quote unquote, defense groups that would be used to battle the fictitious communists. So it just so happens that, of course, the Italian military had funded this conference and was already in the process of setting up the Gladio networks. And I would argue by the time this conference happened, they were already set up in large part. The conference attracted an interesting cast of characters. There was one guy by the name of Pio Filippani Ronconi, Ronconi, who was a former SS Nazi, a journalist by the name of Renato Mili, Mieli, who also was part of the Allied Psychological War Bureau as part of the OSS, and another guy, Guido Giannettini, who also was a quote-unquote journalist. None of these guys are actually journalists, by the way, who was a Secret Service informant, who in 1962 delivered a 3-day lecture to U.S. military officers at the Naval Academy at Annapolis called Techniques and Possibilities of a Coup in Europe. Like, he basically gave a lecture on his job description. And Giannettini was also Dalachet's principal contact inside the Italian Secret Services. One big happy family. Another interesting participant was a journalist by the name of Pino Rauti, Rauti, who was the founder of Ordine Nuovo, which is ON, which is basically New Order. The New Order had been set up in 1956, initially to serve as a study center for all of the fascists, both Italian and German. The group had began training its people in paramilitary training, and these are the guys that initially set up the training camps at Sardinia, which were largely used during the years of lead as part of Operation Gladio and the strategy of tension inside of Italy. He was good friends with Delashay, who was also a member of the New Order in the 1950s, until he set up the more extreme AN later on. By all accounts, the Italian military was highly impressed with the presentations that happened at that conference. So it hired both of the presenters to prepare a pamphlet on basically asserting that there was an ongoing communist infiltration and subversion inside the Italian military, even though there was not, and that it was going to lead to some type of communist overthrow of the Italian government. So, in other words, they arranged a propaganda campaign to scare the hell out of everybody in Italy at this conference. It also said that there was going to be included in the pamphlet a call for creating politicized elite units to defend the nation from communist subversion. They just so happen to look like gladio cells. That's totally like unexpected, said no one ever. A year after the conference, Giannettini would publish something called The Techniques of Revolutionary Warfare, which would prove to be highly influential in the fascist networks all throughout Operation Gladio. He basically based the written product on the presentation made at the original conference. And it became required reading for anyone working in any of the fascist elements of Operation Gladio inside of Italy. In general, Giannettini and Rauti are both considered key architects of the strategy of tension, especially as it relates to Italy. So, it's little surprise that at this point, the unambiguous Delashay was also a participant at that same conference. And a year after the conference, Delashay would become the co-founder of Agenter Press and set that same program up in Portugal. Agenter would become a key instrument of gladio terror throughout Europe and into Africa in all of the Portuguese colonies. In 1969, the Piazza Fontana bombing occurred, and it was basically orchestrated by all of the people that had been at that conference. So, it obviously becomes very apparent, we're almost done with this section, that all of this was part and parcel of Operation Gladio. So, a guy by the name of Ivan Matteo Lombardo was also in attendance at that conference. And you recall that Lombardo was one of the key principal members of the Academy and also a member of the P7 Belgium Operation Gladio elements as well. The Academy appears to have been a key coordinating body for the strategy of tension, Operation Gladio, and the elite networks of the Circle and the Bilderberg Group. The Academy was founded in 1969 and was in communication with Surat and Agenter Press during that same year, which also was part of the Piazza Fontana bombing in Italy. Lombardo joined the Academy in 1970 and apparently became involved in the P7, the part in Belgium, not long afterwards. Then there was the Belgian Partners, who also was all linked to the strategy of tension. That same conference that happened in 1965 began a massive push among the Europeans to set up a more formal structure overseeing all of their strategy of tension terrorist activities. And that's when you saw the creation of a lot of the splinter groups all under the same auspices, though, because they want plausible deniability. So they can't just have Gladio. They have to have these other like sub labels like the New Order and the one that was called the Vanguardia Nationale. They set up all of these other ones so that if any one of them gets caught doing Gladio shit, it'll just look like it's that one thing. They're all Gladio. They just subdivide themselves into other organizations with a quote unquote leader, so that it's plausible deniability for Gladio at all. Just so that you guys understand that. By 1968, the Paladin Group had also been launched, and in 1969, the Academy is created, which links all of them together and provides covert funding avenues for all of them. At the core of this was the notion that terrorism was going to be able to destabilize a democracy and establish a military dictatorship if necessary. But in many cases, destabilizing the country drove people to seek bigger governments, which in and of itself was their overall goal. So all the better if they could pretend it was still a democracy, but destabilize the country enough for you to seek bigger government like they did on 9/11. They would prefer that as opposed to actually having to overthrow the entire government and install a military dictatorship, because then, of course, you get all of the human rights and everybody else involved, and it's not as clean. But rest assured, all of this has everything to do with the strategy of tension and the creation of terror cells in order to create domestic terrorism. So that brings us to our next stopping point. And we can open it up for anyone that wants to talk about this. Initially, we're going to stick to this. And then if we have enough time, we'll open it up for other comments. SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everybody here for attending. I want to say that this here, just listening to what was just said today and what you just read, I want everybody to understand World War II is completely over with. And yet we have all of these Nazis floating around doing all of this stuff that for all intentional purposes the American public understood. We got rid of this shit. No, we didn't. And it just blows my mind.
Yeah, and that really is kind of the key takeaway. And I want you guys just to pause for just a second. SR71 obviously said something very, very insightful. I have oftentimes referred to the fact that we live in a hologram. Now, I want you guys to all just take a deep breath and realize that your government was convinced you we won World War II and defeated Nazism. That's the biggest fucking lie of our entire lifetime. We didn't defeat Nazism. And if your government is capable of creating that big of a hologram and then build upon it and create intelligence apparatuses to destroy what was left of our republic, because there really wasn't a whole lot left at that point anyway. But they used that hologram of the biggest fucking lie ever, that we actually won World War II and defeated Nazism, because we did not. They killed a bunch of people, our best and brightest generation of patriots, to create a mirage that we had defeated Nazism, only to disperse behind our backs those same fucking Nazis all over the world to spawn and rise up under Operation Gladio. If that's not the most evil bastards in the whole world, I don't know what is. It's crazy. Stellar, go ahead.
It really is crazy because when you think about it, so like my brother was a punk rocker back in the like late 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and it was about anarchy against the government and all this other stuff. But in actuality, I'm thinking that that whole scene also was another psyop, because if you look at all of, well, his friends, my brother too, they're all a bunch of Democrats that are like a bunch of, want government to take care of everything, and they're absolutely the opposite of what they originally stood for. And it's just been one psyop after another, after World War II, like what they were doing with the youth, with the brown shirts or whatever, I think is what they called them, and it's just continued on. And I honestly, like you said, I think the Nazis won the war, and their manipulation, propaganda. When I used to live overseas, it was completely different what they were saying over there of what was going on in the United States. And I just believe that, they censored us, or put like if you want to say, put a dome over us so that, true information didn't come through. And thank goodness for these people that have written these books and did discuss these different things. And thank you and all of you guys for exposing and helping us to connect the dots, because it's just been one sick or whatever, matrix, or whatever it is you want to call whatever this reality is.
It's a hologram.
Hologram.
So Tin Man says over on Rumble that imagine how many of these ops are being directly funded by clandestine payments being encumbered by Doge. So let me address that for just a second, because I have a couple of points I want to make. We know that the drug networks were set up initially to pay for all of these operations. So the opium trade was created in the Golden Triangle. It was already existing. But the CIA, the OSS going into the CIA, kind of harnessed an already existing opium trade. Is probably the best way to say that, in order to fund the off the books operations of setting up the Gladio networks, to include generating false flags to create military operations like Korea and Vietnam, in order to generate weapons flows and other skirmishes involving other countries, to generate a military industrial complex continuation. Which is laughable that Eisenhower says, oh my God, be afraid if you ever create a military industrial complex, after he had already created it, because he was part and parcel of setting up Gladio as well. So if you look at that, a large portion of the money for the covert operations came from the drug cells. And obviously, when the CIA figured out that they could also pad their wealth for the oligarchs with the appropriation of taxpayer monies by setting up USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, they did that as well. But don't think that all of this is being funded by the US taxpayer, because it isn't. A lot of it is funded because that money can all be tracked, by the way. What you cannot track is the assassination stuff, and because that's done through off the book operations funded by the drug sales. So anyway, okay, so all along, go ahead.
Yeah.
As he takes a great big breath. I love it. Go ahead.
Okay. Artificial respiration is my name, and it's one probably. Sorry. Let me be clear for a change. Your use of the word hologram is interesting, I find. It's not a word that I have used a lot, so I had to, look it up, and it's to me it seems really relevant. Okay, and in terms of a mixture, a combination of different light sources are used to create a 3D image, and I think that the key term, in as far as I'm picking up, because I want to get your own thoughts about why you use that term, but for me, like what resonates in that term is the use of the fake left. And what I mean by fake left is, the literal history of the compatible left, CIA's phrase that de-emphasized, basically most of CIA history. I mean, basically, if you're an actual leftist and you claim to be for the working class, you have to talk about CIA history, because every president since then, been for the rich. That's a short version. People don't have to agree. Fine. Don't mistake me for a squirrel or a deer in 1978, please. But I'm like, so critical to me, as far as the ingredient of that term, is the use of the fake left to talk about anything except the CIA. So why do you use that term in particular?
For all of those reasons. The way you actually set up a hologram with all of the different light rays to create the hologram, that's basically what they have done. They have used every element of their capabilities, whether it's the media or politics or unions or the chamber or political every element of our world, the Hollywood, every facet of your life, books, everything, schools, everything that you touch throughout your, lifetime is fake. It is like it's being broadcast from some control booth for them to present a fake world around you, and you live in a fake world. You cannot reach your hand out and touch something that's real. Nothing is real. Your bank account is not real because tomorrow they can take it all. Your house isn't real because tomorrow they could take it all. You don't actually have freedom of speech. That's a lie. And who gives a shit if you have a Second Amendment right if you're too fucking scared to use it? Every aspect of our world has been carefully crafted to make us feel comfortable when the entire world is being brought down around us. The Republic was disassembled over 100 years ago. Do you know that? Do you live like you know that? No, because it was carefully crafted to take it down while still giving you the appearance that it exists. That's, to me, was like mind shattering. And that is one of the reasons that keeps me so passionately involved in educating people, for them to wake the hell up and realize that everything, the movies aren't real. They're not even fake. Most of them are actually telling you what they're going to do to you. So the fake world is real and the real world is fake. To me, if that's not a hologram, I don't know what is. So, yeah. Truth, go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Sorry, I just had a fire truck go by me. You're speaking of Germany, and I've kind of been doing a lot of reading and digging into history, and I know it's kind of a touchy subject when you talk about the Nazis and Hitler. And, when you look at a lot of the old newspapers and information about that time frame, it seems like Germany was dealing with a lot of the same stuff that we're dealing with now, with the transgenderism and the smut and all of this stuff that is, kind of brought to us from the Rothschild, Khazarian, Bolsheviks, whatever you want to call them, clan. And that Nazi Germany was similar to Gaddafi was setting up his own central bank and trying to, maybe wasn't as bad of a guy as what there's, I'm not saying he was a good guy, but not like this story that we've been given about World War II is mostly a lie.
So I'm gonna tell you that the story you've been given is a lie, but Hitler is not a good guy. If you go back and the part that those people who try to say, yeah, you read the newspapers from then. Well, if you read the newspapers from Reagan's administration, you'd think he was a great guy. If you read the newspapers from Donald Trump's first term, you'd think he was a really bad guy. You cannot rely on any newspaper. Newspapers have been corrupt for as long as they've been able to print newspapers. So you cannot rely on any newspaper. And I know those people who try to make Hitler a good guy, and I'm not saying that's you. That's all bullshit. You just have to throw the newspaper shit out right out the door. So you have to go back and you have to follow the money. And when you go back and you follow the money, you learn very quickly that the same people that created the Bolshevik Revolution and communism created Hitler to a T, every one of them. They all resided at the same office building in New York City, 120 Broadway. They all resided at the same banks and businesses in the city of London. And I'll give you just a couple of examples because they did it in both former Russia and in Germany. As a matter of fact, many of the companies that supported and funded Hitler in the United States and in Germany continued to, in the United States, fund him throughout World War II. So if these companies, which I refer to as the international syndicate, that funded the communists to come to power in the former Russia and created communism, and those exact same people funded Hitler's rise to power, and they did, then you can't make the argument that Hitler's good if you're not going to make the argument that communism was good too. Because they actually brought Trotsky to the United States, put him up in an apartment and gave him a driver and money in a house with a refrigerator when no one at the time had a refrigerator in the United States except for the very, very wealthy. And they kept him here until they had already won the Bolshevik Revolution. And then they put him on a boat through Canada into the Soviet Union. And they did the exact same thing with Lenin, who had been hanging out in the city of London. So they put him on a train through Germany. So wait a minute, I thought Germany didn't like the communists. Well, evidently they didn't have a problem with the communists because the asshole rode in a train right through Germany into Russia to create the Bolshevik Revolution. So what we have to come to grips with is literally there's an international syndicate that have twisted and paid for every crazy ass thing in our history. These are the same people that owned all of the press way back then. They all owned the same banks. And by the way, if you go and you look at the use of these companies like GE, Ford, Carnegie Steel, all of the railroads, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened and they implemented quote unquote communism in the Soviet Union that, everybody supposedly hated, it was all of these companies that went over and built all of their entire railroad system. GE electrified communist Soviet Union. So if they really didn't like communists, they sure as hell got rich off of them, and they were all paid in the Tsar's gold. As a matter of fact, Sweden was used as the quote unquote neutral country where they shipped gold bars into Sweden. They remelted them and stamped them with the Swedish bank and then brought them into the United States. So you're not going to.
That's exactly what I was saying. And then all wars are bankers' wars, so they're making money off all sides. And I guess my point was certainly that the H guy was not a good guy, but that the people on the other side of that were not good people either.
None of them are good.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And all right, thank you.
Sure. Miles, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel.
Hey.
We were on the front porch. We had a really great conversation. Carolina, that is listening in the audience, we were talking about the control mechanism of how to control the herd inside the hologram. And they had, key phrases and words that would control you, because if the indoctrination wasn't working, or the mind control, or brainwashing wasn't working, they'd always bring up these key words like, well, you're a racist. And they would, control us that way, because then, we felt, oh my God, no, I'm not that. I'm not a racist, because there was always a group of rebels that weren't complying inside the herd. So we brought up another one, a key one that they've been using a lot for a while is anti-Semitic. And, I'm sure you're familiar with that. So we just had a really good conversation, because that was one of their control mechanisms for the herd, to keep us in line. Now, something interesting came out today that we've talked about in the past, is that when you take a group and then you say that they are a terrorist, then certain things can happen to them. And so I'm glad that the cartels were labeled terrorists. We'll see how that works out for them. Thanks, Colonel.
Well, but Miles, I don't know if you missed the beginning of this. The labeling of someone as a terrorist, and specifically the cartels, relies on the CIA and foreign intelligence sources to tell you that this or that person is part of this or that quote unquote terrorist organization. And as long as you're relying on them, it's the same old thing that we got caught in before, where it was only communists got labeled and then everybody became a communist. And as long as they're relying on faulty intelligence in order to delineate who the good guys and bad guys are, we're still in the same stupid position that we've always been. So we have no idea how many quote unquote terrorists Obama killed that were designated as a terrorist based on intelligence that the CIA provided that may have just been competition. So we're still on that slippery slope, and I don't like that at all.
Well, can we have a DC cartel?
Well, you're never going to get them labeled as a terrorist organization. But Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to talk about Naomi Klein a little bit. So I posted something in the Pill, a really good video where she explains a lot of stuff. It's really amazing. But I actually know her, and I worked with her at Occupy Wall Street. So I'm not talking out of my bum. She turned basically during COVID. And I think she had a little bit of Trump derangement syndrome. And she's also one of those hyper green people. She's actually an economist. She's from Canada. And some people I know that also worked with her, we kind of question where she is now. She also worked at The Intercept and you just posted recently about some of that stuff. So we have a few questions. I just want to throw that out there because I don't want people to, ride on the horse that she's necessarily a good person.
Yeah, I don't quote people because I'm endorsing the people. I'm obviously just talking about, as it related to this book, her observations about these things. So if you guys, especially when I'm doing a book review, just because I'm saying what's in the book doesn't mean I'm endorsing people. But thanks for that. SR71, go ahead and go.
Thank you, Colonel. Just two items here. For those that are new here, you made the valid point, Colonel, that the press has already been bought and paid for. It was bought and paid for a long time ago. If people don't believe Operation Mockingbird is still going on, or when Operation Mockingbird started, go back and listen to some of the Colonel's talks here, and you'll really find out what's going on. The other thing I want to say about keywords that get thrown around, democracy is another one. So keep that in mind when somebody says democracy. I just get the root. Thank you, Colonel.
Yeah. It's almost as big a trigger word now as anti-communist, right? When you start reading all of these different books or the websites or whatever, like anytime I see the word anti-communist now, the hair on the back of my neck stands up. And we are at that point with the promotion of quote unquote democracy. I agree with you 100%. Okay, so it's 5:30. I'm going to bring Stellar back up just in case she had something that she wanted to add, but then I'm going to sign off and get ready for dinner. Go ahead, Stellar.
Yeah, I was going to just totally agree with what SR71 was saying. As soon as you hear the word democracy, it's like it makes you cringe because we're a republic. And, they're all about, anything that says, they say anti-communism, that's what they're about. It's actually the opposite. And so it's just insane.
Yeah. But think about that, Stellar, and SR71. That's kind of profound, right? How much just going through Operation Gladio, how much more aware we are of the CIA's propaganda war, and our surroundings and the language that is used. This has changed all of us in a very good way to make us better citizens, a much more aware citizenry. Miles?
You said something really interesting a little while ago, that the realities are different. So you were talking like the movies are more real than our reality because of how they set things up for us, that we're in like a matrix or a hologram.
Right.
So it's interesting. I think the people that are trying to wake us up and help us, that I've talked about this in spaces a lot, that there's been a lot of like movie magic or staged events to try to help us navigate through this war zone or minefield. Would you agree that maybe some things have been manipulated to help us that way?
I don't know. I don't go along those lines. I just deal with what is put in front of me. I don't like manipulation, even if it's for good. So I don't think along those lines at all. And I know a lot of people do. I just don't.
Well, the only reason I do is because we're in a war of lies. And how are we going to win the war if we're not lying?
No. You don't become your enemy to win. I just vehemently disagree with that. So anyway, I understand that people will not necessarily agree with that, and I'm fine with that. I'm not going there personally. Stellar, go ahead.
I agree with you too. I don't believe that there's heartbreaking as shocking as it's going to be. There should be no manipulation when it comes to the truth, and disclosure should be brought forth completely because of all of the manipulations. Our entire life was a lie. Everything that we've been taught was a lie. Everything that we believed we were doing, which was good to help people throughout the world, was a lie. It's like, you hear that 80-20 rule, and it's like, unfortunately, our entire world, 80% of it was a lie, and there was only maybe 20% that was truth. Whether it was words that they used in, like, what was it you were saying, those coups, the different names that they use, coups, they use different names for different things to throw you off. Yeah. But in actuality, it still comes down to Operation Gladio, their playbook, the freaking international syndicate, the evil sickos that they were. They had their hands in both sides of everything, and controlled and manipulated. And if you didn't play their way, they were going to crush, kill, and destroy you and take all of your assets too from your country, and everything was about enslavement. So no, that's how we've lived. And we didn't know that that's what it was. And the censorships that they've had on different countries, because they only want their citizens to know so much or not know everything or even a part of it. So no, everything has to be disclosed. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Richard, I'm sorry. I've got to go. Tonight is my family dinner night with my family. So if you come back tomorrow, I'll put you up first, but I do have to run, you guys. Thank you for being here. And I will be on Alpha Warrior Show tonight at 9:30 on his channel, the Alpha Warrior Show. We're going to finish up USAID by talking about the Office of Transition Initiatives. I've been posting a lot about that. I want to kind of just do a roll-up summary to get it on record as part of that series. So if you've been following the threads that I've been putting out, we're basically going to dive into a couple of the companies in there and a couple of the people that were involved in that. And that way we get it on the record as part of his series, because what I really want to do with that series is use that kind of as our bookmarker for Operation Gladio, as we have kind of exposed all of the different elements of it, to include obviously the non-governmental governmental organizations, what Operation Gladio actually is, and a lot of the characters involved in it. And obviously we covered a lot of the stuff that has happened here in the United States that no one is even tracking as part of Operation Gladio, because they don't even know what Operation Gladio is. So anyway, I just want to get it on the record, and look forward to seeing you guys there tonight. So take care.
Oh, and are you having War Hamster tomorrow morning too?
War Hamster at noon tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay, noon tomorrow, 9 o'clock Pacific time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry,
that's okay.
Sure I got them both.
That's okay. No, thank you for reminding me, Stellar. Take care, everybody. All right, guys, gotta run. Take care.